Hello, this is Pastor Malin Smith, pastor here at New Hope Baptist Church here in Watertown, New York, and I welcome you today to our video on the book of Lamentations, where we're going to suggest the theme of finding hope in God when there seems to be no hope. Now, our vision here at New Hope Baptist Church is living life together by bringing new hope in Jesus to all people. And here in the book of Lamentations, we find the prophet Jeremiah writing. Now, we mentioned in our last video on the book of Jeremiah that Jeremiah was known as the weeping prophet. And here in the book of Lamentations, we find Jeremiah expressing his grief in all of its fullness. We read in 2 Chronicles chapter 35, verse 25, the occasion for the writing of the book of Lamentations. I'll pick up the text in verse 24 of 2 Chronicles chapter 35. So his servants took him out of the chariot and carried him in the second chariot which he had, and brought him to Jerusalem, where he died and was buried in the tombs of his fathers. All Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. Then Jeremiah chanted a lament for Josiah, and all the male and female singers speak about Josiah in their lamentations to this day. And they made them an ordinance in Israel. Behold, they are also written in the Lamentations. That's 2 Chronicles chapter 35, verses 24 and 25. So we see reference there to the composition of the book of Lamentations. Undoubtedly, I think, Jeremiah being the author. So we see at least initially the occasion for the writing of the book of Lamentations. Of course, King Josiah was the godliest king who had ever reigned in Jerusalem's history. And when he died in battle, it caused great tumult in Jerusalem. Evidently, Jeremiah had looked up to him because Josiah, in addition to being a great king, was a very godly king. He had introduced much reform and revival in Jerusalem. And so his death marked the end of a major part of Jerusalem's history, as well as the sun setting on its spiritual history. It wasn't going to be long after Josiah's death, within a span of a few decades, where Jerusalem would fall to the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC, which is why Lamentations came to be used to remember that particular event. The Jews today still remember what they call the 9th of Av, and the 9th of Av would correspond to our month of August. In 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had led the Babylonians against Jerusalem, and Jerusalem fell. We also know, too, that the Romans, evidently on the 9th of Av, 70 AD, they sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. And so, typically, at least throughout most of Israel's history, to commemorate this particular date, normally, the book of Lamentations would have been read in their synagogues as a way of commemorating those events. So certainly there is a tone of great sadness and sorrow that accompanies the book of Lamentations. And again, it reminds us of the fact that this is real history. Not only real history, but the fact that God is deeply concerned and in contact with the plight of His people, because God wants a relationship with us. And in all relationships, there's an entire spectrum of emotions. And certainly we see what is going on here in the book of Lamentations pertaining to that. I find it interesting that in concerning Lamentations' name in the original Hebrew, it simply means how. Have you ever asked God that question when you're going through a major season, a trial? How could this happen, God? Why did this happen? And so you hear that question being asked throughout the book. Scholars Kale and Dalich have summarized each of the 5 chapters of the book of Lamentations in the following way. The first chapter is a lament over Jerusalem going into exile. Jeremiah loved his city, loved his people. And perhaps you can identify with that. Maybe you've had family members whom you loved and you've seen them go wayward. And so you're pleading with them to come back to God. But we see that in the first chapter. Then Kale and Dalich notice in the second chapter how we see there dealt with the destruction of Jerusalem being due to God's wrath. And so Jerusalem falls. In the 3rd chapter, we see spiritual sufferings of the people undergoing trials. Not only was there a physical destruction in Jerusalem, but the consequences that followed dealt with spiritual trials as well. In the 4th chapter, we see there the misery of the Jews after the fall of Jerusalem. And certainly we see that detailed in the 4th chapter. Then the final chapter, Cale and Delitzsch notice how God is entreated to remove the shame and to restore the people. So there again, we find this twofold pattern throughout the prophets. That starts with the bad news, but then looks to God, our hope, our salvation. What I want to do today in the remainder of our time, I just simply want to share with you perhaps what is the most beloved section in the book of Lamentations. Lamentations 3:20-26. And I find in these verses a recipe for hope. So perhaps you watching this video today, you're really going through a very tough season in life. You maybe have lost almost all hope. And you're wondering how you're going to be able to get through. And I'm here to tell you today, when all hope seems to be lost, we can look to God as our hope. Lamentations 3, verse 20 says this, "Surely my soul remembers and is bowed down within me. This I recall to my mind. Therefore I have hope. The Lord's loving kindnesses indeed never cease, for His compassions never fail." So what is the recipe for hope we find in Lamentations? Well, number one, we recall God's faithfulness. And note this, for a man who saw his city destroyed, this recipe was needed. So a good recipe for hope then is to recall God's faithfulness. But notice next in Lamentations 3:24, "The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I have hope in Him." So a recipe for hope in Lamentations, not only do we recall God's faithfulness, but secondly, we rely on God's graces. The fact that God is Jeremiah's portion. Can you say that about yourself? Is God your portion? When everything else is dried up, when friends, family, job, security, comfort, all of that is gone, health, can you honestly say that you are relying on God and the graces that He offers? And then concerning the third ingredient in our recipe for hope that we find here in the book of Lamentations, not only do we recall God's faithfulness, not only do we rely on His graces, but thirdly, we rest in God. Lamentations 3:25 and 26. "The Lord is good to those who wait for Him, to the person who seeks Him. It is good that he waits silently for the salvation of the Lord." And so that's a recipe for hope. And that's what Jeremiah points us to in the book of Lamentations. Again, notice the theme. Finding hope in God when there seems to be no hope. And I underscore that word seems, because we cannot ultimately judge what we see with physical eyes, but rather by what we perceive with the eyes of faith. God is our hope.